The dust of Redemption Gulch didn't just settle on the cracked boardwalks and thirsty horses. It settled in the soul. For 17-year-old Amelia Vance, it was a shroud. Every morning, the Arizona sun would crest the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, painting the sky in hues of fire and hope, but for her, it only illuminated the prison of her life. The pain in her left arm was a constant vicious reminder, a splintered bone set, crooked a living monument to her father's rage. They called him Orville Vance, a man whose dreams had dried up with the last gold pan, leaving only bitterness behind, and she was the tool he used to chip away at the world's pity, one tarnished coin at a time. This is the story of how that pain became a beacon seen by the one man who understood that freedom isn't given. It's forged in the very fires of despair. The air in the one-room shack on the edge of Redemption Gulch was always thick with the scent of stale whiskey and regret. It clung to the rough-hewn wooden walls, the threadbare blanket on Amelia's cot, and the very clothes on her back. Outside, the world was vast and brutal, a sprawling canvas of ochre desert and sapphire sky. Inside it was small, suffocating, and ruled by the tempestuous moods of Orville Vance. Amelia moved with the practiced caution of a mouse in a room with a sleeping cat. She was tending to the small fire in the hearth, coaxing a flame from a few precious sticks of mesquite. Her movements were stiff, her face a pale mask of concentration. The day's meager earnings, a handful of coins amounting to less than $1, sat on the corner of the rickety table, a pathetic offering to a demanding god. Orville sat hunched over that same table, a near-empty bottle of rye, his only companion. His face, once handsome, in a rugged frontier sort of way, was now a ruin. Veins spiderwebbed across his nose and cheeks, and his eyes, a washed-out blue, held a perpetual storm of fury. He had come west, chasing the promise of gold, of a life built with his own 2 hands. But the land had been unyielding, the gold illusory, and the failure had hollowed him out, leaving a creature of pure, corrosive resentment. "Is that all?" His voice was a low growl, a sound that made the fine hairs on Amelia's arms stand up. She didn't turn. The stage was late. Not many folks in town today, Pa. He slammed the bottle down on the table, making the coins jump. "Don't you lie to me, girl. I saw Mrs. Holloway from the general store give you a whole nickel. A whole nickel, and I don't see it there." Amelia's heart hammered against her ribs. She had used the nickel to buy a small heel of bread, half of which she had eaten on the walk home, the gnawing hunger in her belly too strong to ignore. The other half was tucked inside her dress. I was hungry, Pa." The words were a whisper, lost in the crackle of the fire. He was on his feet in an instant, his chair scraping violently against the packed earth floor. He crossed the small room in 2 long strides, his shadow swallowing her whole. He grabbed her shoulder, his fingers digging into the muscle like talons. "Hungry, you eat what I say you can eat. Every cent you make belongs to me. It's the price you pay for the roof over your head. The price for my protection." Protection. The word was a bitter joke. Protection from what the world outside was cruel. But nothing matched the intimate daily cruelty of this shack. He spun her around to face him. His breath was a foul wave of cheap liquor and decay. "Where is it?" he snarled. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and shameful. With a trembling hand, she reached into her bodice and pulled out the small cloth-wrapped piece of bread. His eyes fixated on it, not as food, but as an act of defiance, a theft of his property. His face contorted into a mask of rage. "You steal from me, from your own father. No, Pa, I just..." Her words were cut off by a searing explosion of pain. He had her left arm in his grip, twisting it with a drunkard's unnatural strength. She cried out a high, thin sound of pure agony. "You think you can be independent?" He roared, his face inches from hers. "You think you can keep things for yourself? You are nothing without me. You are a tool, and a tool does what its master commands." He gave another violent twist. There was a sound that Amelia would hear in her nightmares for the rest of her life. It wasn't loud, but it was horrifyingly distinct. A wet, sickening crack like a green branch being snapped over a knee. The world went white. An agony unlike anything she had ever known flooded her senses, a blinding, all-consuming fire that raced from her wrist to her shoulder. She collapsed to the floor, cradling the ruined limb, a strangled sob tearing from her throat. Her arm felt disconnected. It flopped at an unnatural angle, a broken puppet's limb. Orville stood over her, breathing heavily. For a moment, a flicker of something shock, perhaps even a sliver of regret, crossed his face. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a cold, calculating look. He wasn't looking at his daughter. He was looking at his asset. He knelt not with concern, but with the detached air of a carpenter assessing a damaged tool. He poked at her arm, and she screamed again, a raw animal sound. "Hush up," he hissed. "Your caterwauling will bring the sheriff." He looked at the grotesquely bent limb. A slow, terrible smile spread across his lips. It was a smile of inspiration, a moment of grotesque epiphany. "Well now," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "This changes things. This changes things for the better." He tore a strip from their one spare blanket and began to bind her arm tightly against her body, a crude, makeshift splint that did nothing for the pain but immobilized the shattered bones. The agony was so intense that black spots danced in her vision. "No more hiding coins now, eh?" he murmured almost to himself. "No more thoughts of doing anything for yourself. People are soft. They see a pretty girl, they might give a penny. But they see a poor, crippled girl, a girl with a broken wing." He chuckled a dry, rattling sound. "They'll empty their pockets, yes. This is much, much better." He finished his work and stood up, surveying her, as she lay whimpering on the floor. The last light of day filtered through the single grimy window, casting long shadows that made the small shack feel like a tomb. "Get some rest," Orville Vance said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "You have a big day tomorrow. A very profitable day." He turned, picked up his bottle and sat back down at the table, leaving Amelia to drown in a sea of darkness and pain. She was no longer just his daughter, no longer just his beggar. She was now his masterpiece of manufactured pity, a broken thing designed to bleed the world dry, one coin of sympathy at a time. And in the heart of the unforgiving Arizona desert, under a sky full of indifferent stars, Amelia Vance knew she had just fallen into a deeper circle of hell. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the dusty main street of Redemption Gulch. The heat shimmered off the parched earth, making the distant mesas wobble and distort. For the townsfolk, it was just another day of sweat and toil. For Amelia, it was a waking nightmare. Orville had shoved her out of the shack at dawn with a chunk of stale cornbread and a tin cup. "Find a good spot," he'd instructed, his eyes glinting with avarice. "Right in front of the saloon is best. The drunks are more generous before they're completely soused. And don't you forget to look pathetic. Shouldn't be hard." Now she sat on the edge of the boardwalk, her back pressed against the rough, sun-baked wood of the saloon's facade. Her left arm, bound tightly in its dirty sling, throbbed with a relentless, fiery rhythm. Every breath, every slight movement, sent a fresh wave of nausea and agony through her. She kept her head down, her long, tangled brown hair falling like a curtain to hide her face. The shame was a physical weight, heavier than the heat, more painful than her broken bone. People passed by. Boots scuffed on the wooden planks, spurs jingled with a musicality that felt like a mockery. The scents of horse manure, cheap perfume and frying bacon from the nearby diner mingled in the air. She could feel their eyes on her. Some glances were fleeting, indifferent. Others were laced with a pity that burned worse than contempt. A few, mostly, the severe-looking church-going women, shot her looks of pure disdain as if her poverty and injury were a personal affront to their orderly world. A coin clattered into her cup. A penny. She didn't look up, just mumbled, "God bless you." The words felt like ash in her mouth. Her world had shrunk to this small patch of dusty boardwalk. The symphony of the town, the blacksmith's hammer ringing against steel, the boisterous laughter from the saloon, the creak of a wagon's wheels was a distant hum. Her reality was the throbbing in her arm, the hollow ache in her stomach, and the clink of coins in a tin cup. This was her father's design. To be seen, but not as a person. She was an object of pity, a walking wound. Hours bled into one another under the oppressive sun. The cup began to feel heavier, the coins a cold, dead weight of her own degradation. Orville was watching. She knew he was. He'd be lurking somewhere in the shadows of an alleyway, or watching from a saloon window, making sure she didn't talk to anyone, didn't try to run, didn't keep a single cent for herself. Late in the afternoon, when the shadows began to stretch long and thin like skeletal fingers across the street, a new presence entered her periphery. It wasn't the heavy tread of a cowboy or the lighter step of a townswoman. It was silent. A pair of worn, knee-high moccasins, decorated with simple, faded beadwork, came to a stop just before her. She didn't look up expecting them to move on like all the others who chose not to engage, but they remained. The silence stretched, becoming more profound than the noise of the street. It drew her gaze upward against her will. The man was tall and lean, built of sinew and bone, hardened by the sun and the land. He was Navajo, his heritage, clear in the proud lines of his face, his high cheekbones, and his straight black hair, tied back with a simple leather cord. But his eyes were what held her. They were dark, deep-set, and possessed an unnerving stillness. They weren't looking at her broken arm or the pathetic cup in her lap. They were looking at her. It felt as if he could see right through the grime and the shame to the terrified girl cowering inside. He wore simple buckskin trousers and a plain cotton shirt, and a knife was sheathed at his belt. He carried no gun, at least not visibly. He was an outsider here, a man of the desert who walked through the white man's town with a quiet confidence that set him apart. His name was Kyle, a name known to the trackers, and the army scouts whispered with respect in the far-flung outposts of the territory. He was a man who read stories in broken twigs and overturned stones, who could follow a trail a week old across bare rock. And now he was reading the story of Amelia Vance. He saw the way she flinched when a loud voice boomed from the saloon. He saw the faint older bruises on her right arm, the one not in the sling. He saw the desperate hunger behind the veil of her downcast eyes. And he saw the raw, untended state of her injury, an injury that bespoke violence, not accident. Without a word, he knelt, his movements fluid and unhurried. The sudden proximity made Amelia recoil, her heart seizing with a familiar fear. Men who got this close only ever wanted one thing to hurt her or use her. But he didn't reach for her. He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and took out a coin. It wasn't a penny or a nickel. It was a silver dollar, gleaming and heavy. He dropped it into her cup, and the sound it made, a solid, resonant thunk, was different from the tinny clatter of the other coins. It was a sound of substance, of significance. Amelia stared at the silver dollar, her breath catching in her throat. It was more money than she had ever held at one time. It was a fortune. It was a danger. Her father would be ecstatic, and then he would be suspicious. Where had it come from? She finally lifted her head fully, her eyes meeting Cale's. I can't, she stammered, her voice hoarse from disuse. He simply shook his head, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. His gaze flickered for a fraction of a second, moving past her to the dark alleyway across the street. A silent message passed between them. He sees. He understands. He knew she wasn't alone. Then he spoke, his voice low and calm with a cadence that seemed more a part of the wind than of the town's harsh chatter. "The desert is cruel," he said, his eyes returning to hers. "But it does not break its children on purpose." And with that, he stood up, turned and walked away, his moccasined feet making no sound on the dusty street. He didn't look back. He simply melted back into the flow of the town, a silent shadow that had briefly touched her life and left behind a gleaming silver question in its wake. Amelia stared at the coin, her heart pounding, a frantic, terrified rhythm. The man's words echoed in her mind. It does not break its children on purpose. For the first time in a very long time, someone had looked at her and seen not a beggar, not a cripple, not a tool, but a child who had been broken. The silver dollar was more than money. It was a testament. It was an acknowledgement. And from the shadows of the alley, Orville Vance also stared. He hadn't heard the words, but he had seen the coin. He had seen the way the Navajo had looked at his daughter, and a new venomous seed of suspicion and rage began to sprout in the barren wasteland of his soul. The shadow had brought a coin, but it had also brought trouble. The silver dollar had bought Amelia a night free from a beating, but it had purchased no peace. Orville had snatched the day's earnings with greedy, trembling hands, his eyes fixated on the gleaming coin. He had spent half of it on a top-shelf bottle of whiskey at the saloon, and the other half on a faro game he inevitably lost. The momentary reprieve his good mood had provided evaporated, leaving behind a simmering suspicion that was even more dangerous than his usual rage. "Who was he?" he had demanded, shaking her by her good shoulder. "Why would an Indian give you $1? What did you do for it?" "Nothing pay." She had pleaded, the familiar terror coiling in her gut. "He just dropped it in the cup and walked away. I don't know him." Her genuine fear had for once convinced him, but the seed was planted. Orville now watched her with the hawk-like intensity of a man guarding a treasure he suspected was trying to escape. Meanwhile, Kyle moved through Redemption Gulch like a ghost. He was a man accustomed to the periphery, to the spaces in between. He didn't loiter in the saloon or make idle chat at the mercantile. He observed. He listened. The town was a living thing, and like any living thing, it had its own language, its own secrets whispered on the wind. His first stop was not the sheriff's office. The law in these parts was a blunt instrument, often rusty, and wielded with reluctance. It had little time for the subtle cruelties that happened behind closed doors. Instead, he went to Holloway's general store. It was run by Martha Holloway, a widow in her late 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that hid a well of weary compassion. She had seen more of life in Redemption Gulch than most, and missed very little. Kyle entered the store, the small bell above the door announcing his presence. The interior smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and canvas. Martha was behind the counter, measuring out a length of calico fabric. She looked up, her expression neutral, but her eyes assessing. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice crisp. Kyle did not approach the counter directly. He moved towards a barrel of dried pinto beans, picking up a few and letting them run through his long fingers. "I need supplies," he said quietly. "Bacon, coffee, and information." Martha finished her cutting, her movements precise. She folded the fabric and set it aside for the customer who had ordered it. "Supplies I sell. Information is usually earned or paid for." "I paid for some yesterday." Kyle said, his gaze steady. "A $1. Martha's hands stilled. She looked at him properly now, recognition dawning in her eyes. She was the one who had given Amelia the nickel, an act of small, futile kindness. She had seen the Navajo kneel before the girl. She lowered her voice, gesturing with her head towards the front window, which looked out onto the main street. "That girl, Amelia. It's a bad business." Her arm. Kyle stated not as a question, but as a fact waiting for confirmation. "It was no accident." Martha's lips tightened into a thin line. She leaned forward slightly, her voice barely a whisper. "Her father, Orville Vance, came into town 2 years ago. Said he was a prospector. Never found a speck of color. All he's ever found is the bottom of a bottle. He was always mean, but it's gotten worse. He lost his claim a few months back. Since then, he puts her on that street every day, rain or shine. The arm, that happened 3 days ago. He came in here that night buying bandages and a bottle of the cheapest rotgut. Said she'd had a fall, slipped by the creek." "There is no creek near their shack," Kyle said flatly. "Exactly," Martha confirmed, her eyes hard. "He's a monster, but he's her father. People around here, they don't like to meddle in family affairs. They look the other way." "Who is the law here?" "Sheriff Brody. He's a good man, mostly, but he's got his hands full with cattle rustlers and drunken cowboys shooting up the saloon. He sees Orville as a town drunk and Amelia as his responsibility. He won't step in unless someone is dead." She sighed, a puff of weary frustration. "And maybe not even then." Kyle nodded slowly, absorbing the information. He purchased his supplies, paying with a few coins from his pouch. As Martha wrapped the bacon in brown paper, she looked at him again. "You're not from around here. Why the interest? I've seen traps like that before." Kyle said, his voice distant, tinged with a memory Amelia couldn't possibly know. "A wounded animal left as bait. I don't like the look of the hunter." He took his supplies and left the store, the bell marking his departure. His next stop was the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody was a man in his 50s, with a drooping mustache and a belly that strained the buttons of his vest. His office was cluttered and smelled of stale cigar smoke and old paper. He was working on a wanted poster, painstakingly copying a description, when Cale's shadow fell across his desk. Brody looked up. His eyes narrowed with the automatic suspicion of a lawman seeing a Navajo he didn't recognize. "Something I can do for you." "I am here about the girl," Cale said, his tone even and direct. "Amelia Vance." Brody leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning in protest. "What about her?" "Her father broke her arm." The sheriff sighed, putting down his pen. He'd had this conversation before, though usually with worried church ladies, not a quiet, intense native tracker. "You saw him do it. I saw the result. I saw the fear in her eyes. I know the look of a man like Orville Vance." "Look," Brody said, his voice laced with practiced weariness. "Orville's a worthless drunk, I'll give you that. But he's her kin. The law is a clumsy thing when it comes to a man's own family. He says she fell. She says she fell. Unless you or someone else can prove otherwise, my hands are tied. I can't go arresting a man based on your look." "So you will wait," Kyle stated, "until he breaks the other arm or her neck." Brody's face hardened. He didn't like being challenged, especially not like this. I'm telling you the law, that's all. I've warned Vance before about his public drunkenness. I've got my eye on him. But what he does in his own home, it's a grey area. There is no grey area between right and wrong, Kyle said, his voice dangerously quiet. Maybe not where you come from, the sheriff retorted, gesturing vaguely towards the window and the vast wilderness beyond. But here in town it's almost all grey. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual crimes to deal with. Kyle held the sheriff's gaze for a long moment, an unspoken challenge passing between them. Then he turned and walked out, leaving Brody feeling vaguely uneasy and defensive. The whispers in the dust had confirmed everything Kyle suspected. The town knew. The law knew. But they were all paralyzed by custom, by fear, by indifference. They were content to watch the girl be destroyed, so long as it happened quietly behind a closed door. Kyle stood in the harsh afternoon sun, looking down the street to where Amelia still sat, a small, hunched figure of misery. He now understood the terrain. Orville was the predator, Amelia the bait. The town was the indifferent wilderness that allowed it to happen. And Sheriff Brody was the high cliff wall that offered no path for escape. If Amelia was to be freed, the law would not be the key. Justice in this matter would not come from a badge or a cell. It would have to be taken. And Kyle knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he would be the one to take it. The hunter would have to be hunted. A change had settled over Amelia's desolate world. It was subtle but profound. The silent man, Kyle, was a constant presence, now a guardian shadow at the edge of her vision. He never approached her directly again during the long, sweltering days of her vigil on the boardwalk. But she knew he was there. She would see him across the street, leaning against a veranda post, seemingly watching the world go by, but his gaze would always be canted in her direction. Sometimes he would be at the livery, talking quietly with the hostler. Other times he'd be atop the mercantile, a silhouette against the setting sun. His presence was a strange mixture of comfort and terror. It was a comfort to know that someone in this pitiless town saw her, truly saw her, but it was a terror because she knew her father saw him too. Orville's paranoia grew with each passing day. His questions became more pointed, his accusations more venomous. He would frisk her more thoroughly at the end of each day, his rough hands searching for any hidden coin or scrap of food, his whiskey-soured breath hot on her face as he growled, "What's that Indian want with you? What are you plotting?" One evening, 3 days after Kyle's visit to the sheriff, the cruelty of her situation became unbearable. Orville had been drinking heavily, and the day's earnings were slim. He'd backhanded her for it, the blow catching her on the cheek, splitting her lip. The coppery taste of her own blood mingled with the ever-present dust in her throat. Later, as she lay on her cot, feigning sleep, while her father snored in a drunken stupor, the shack door creaked open. Amelia's entire body went rigid with fear. She thought Orville had risen to torment her further, but the figure that slipped inside was silent, moving with a grace that her father could never possess. It was Cale. In the faint moonlight filtering through the grimy window, she could see he carried a small bundle. He moved to her side, his presence filling the small, wretched space with an aura of calm that felt utterly alien. He knelt beside her cot. "Do not be afraid," he whispered, his voice as soft as the desert wind. She couldn't speak, her throat tight with a knot of fear and confusion. He gestured to the bundle. "There is food and medicine for your arm. A clean bandage." He had a small wooden bowl containing a dark, pungent poultice. It is made from comfrey root. It will help the bone knit and ease the pain. Tears streamed silently down Amelia's face. The simple, profound kindness of the gesture shattered the dam of her composure. For someone to risk entering this den to bring her comfort was a thing she had forgotten was possible. He seemed to understand her silent turmoil. With infinite gentleness, he began to unwrap the filthy rags Orville had used as a sling. The stench of sweat and grime was thick. As the bandage came away, revealing the bruised, swollen, and unnaturally angled forearm, Kyle's jaw tightened, a flicker of cold anger in his dark eyes. He worked with a tracker's precision and a healer's touch. He gently applied the cool, soothing poultice to the hot, inflamed skin around the break. The relief was immediate, a blessed wave washing over the fiery agony. Then he took fresh, clean strips of cotton cloth and began to rebind the arm, his hand supporting the limb, with a firmness that was both secure and surprisingly gentle. It was the first time her arm had been touched without causing a fresh explosion of pain. He finished his work and then placed the rest of the bundle beside her. It contained a piece of jerky, an apple, and a small water skin. A feast. "Eat," he whispered. "Get your strength." As Amelia reached for the apple with her good hand, a floorboard behind them groaned. Both of them froze. The snoring from Orville's corner had stopped. Slowly the massive, disheveled form of Orville Vance rose from his bed. He wasn't fully awake, but his drunkard senses had picked up the intrusion. In the dim light, his eyes were wild and unfocused, but they fixed on the scene before him, the Navajo kneeling over his daughter, the clean bandage, the food. A low, animalistic growl rumbled in his chest. "Get your hands off her!" Kyle rose to his feet in a single fluid motion, placing himself between Orville and Amelia. He was taller than Vance, but leaner. Orville was a bear of a man, powered by whiskey and raw fury. "She needs a doctor," Kyle said, his voice calm and steady, a rock against which Orville's rage would break. "She needs to learn her place," Orville roared, now fully awake and incensed. "And you need to learn to stay away from what's mine." He lunged, not at Kyle, but at Amelia. He was a creature of instinct, and his instinct was to strike at the source of his perceived betrayal. Kyle moved with impossible speed, intercepting him. He didn't throw a punch. He used Orville's own momentum against him, stepping aside and redirecting the charge. Orville stumbled past him, crashing into the wall with a loud thud that shook the entire shack. Orville roared in frustration and spun around, grabbing a heavy cast-iron skillet from the hearth. He swung it wildly, a clumsy, murderous arc through the air. Kyle ducked under the blow, the skillet whistling past his head and smashing into the wooden table, splintering it. Kyle didn't escalate the violence. His goal was not to beat Orville, but to contain him and escape. He grabbed the wrist of the hand holding the skillet, applying pressure to a point that made Orville's fingers go numb. The skillet clattered to the floor. At the same time, Kyle swept Orville's leg from under him. The big man went down hard, his head hitting the packed earth floor with a dull thud. He was dazed but not unconscious. "Go," Kyle said to Amelia, his voice urgent but still calm. "Now, run." But Amelia was frozen, paralyzed by a lifetime of terror. The idea of disobeying, of running, was as foreign and impossible as the idea of flying. She was a bird with a broken wing, not just physically, but in her very soul. Orville, groaning, began to push himself up. He looked from Kyle to his petrified daughter, and a look of diabolical understanding crossed his face. He knew her fear. He had cultivated it. It was his greatest weapon. He ignored Kyle. He scrambled towards Amelia, grabbing her by her hair with his good hand. He dragged her from the cot, a scream of pain and terror tearing from her lips. "You see," he snarled his face, contorted in a triumphant leer, his eyes locked on Cale. "She's mine. She won't ever leave me." He held her in front of him, a human shield. Cale stood motionless, his hands clenched into fists. He could easily overpower Orville again, but not without risking injury to Amelia. He was trapped. Orville, seeing he had won, let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Get out!" he spat at Cale. "Get out of my home! And if I ever see you near my daughter again, I'll finish the job on her arm. Then I'll start on the other one." The threat hung in the air, vile and absolute. It was not a bluff. Cale knew it. Amelia knew it. Cale looked at Amelia, her face a mask of white terror tears carving clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. Her eyes pleaded with him, but what they pleaded for he wasn't sure. For him to save her, or for him to leave to stop making things worse, with a final lingering look of cold promise at Orville. Cale backed away towards the door. Every instinct screamed at him to stay, to fight to end this. But he saw the checkmate. Orville would use Amelia's own body as a weapon against her rescuer. Any direct help would only bring her more pain. He slipped out of the shack and into the cold desert night, the sounds of Amelia's terrified sobs and Orville's triumphant drunken laughter following him. The price of his kindness had been to reveal the true depths of Orville's monstrousness and to tighten the chains around his daughter even further. The path of quiet observation was over. The hunter had been warned. The next move would have to be the final one. The morning after Kyle's failed intervention was the worst of Amelia's life. The fresh, clean bandage was gone, torn away by Orville, and replaced with the same filthy rags. The poultice was gone. The jerky and apple had been thrown into the fire, a symbolic destruction of another's kindness. Orville didn't even speak to her. He handled her with a cold, brutal efficiency, his silence more terrifying than his yelling. He was making a point. Any hope she might have had was an illusion. Her world began and ended with him. When he forced her out onto the street, he added a new humiliation. He tied a short length of rope loosely around her ankle, staking the other end to the leg of a bench outside the saloon. It wasn't tight enough to stop her from moving a few feet, but it was a clear and visible symbol to the entire town. She was property, a tethered animal. The shame was a physical inferno. The townsfolk who had once offered pity now just stared with a mixture of horror and fascination before hurrying on their way. They were witnesses to her ultimate degradation, and their silent complicity made them part of her prison. When Cale appeared at his usual vantage point across the street, Amelia felt a surge of despair. She wouldn't look at him. She couldn't. His presence, once a strange comfort, was now a source of acute pain. He had tried to help, and in doing so, had shown her the true hopelessness of her situation. Her father would never let her go. Any attempt to free her would only result in more inventive cruelties. Kyle watched his face, an unreadable mask of stone, but his eyes burned with a cold fire. He saw the rope. He saw the new bruise on her face. He saw the utter desolation in her posture. He had underestimated the depth of Orville Vance's depravity. He had thought of him as a common brute, but this public, symbolic shackling was the work of a tyrant who savored control above all else. He knew he couldn't approach her. Orville was surely watching from the saloon window, nursing a drink and gloating. Any interaction would be met with immediate violent retribution on Amelia. He turned and walked not towards the sheriff's office, but towards the livery stable at the end of town. He needed to think to find a new path. The direct approach had failed. The legal approach was a dead end. He needed leverage. A key to a lock he hadn't yet found. He spent the day asking quiet questions, not about Orville and his daughter, but about Orville himself. He spoke to the hostler, to a traveling prospector, to anyone who might have crossed paths with Vance before he washed up in Redemption Gulch. The picture that emerged was fragmented a card player with a reputation for being a sore loser, a man who talked big about claims he never worked a ghost, who had drifted in from the New Mexico territory. It was that last piece of information that snagged Kyle's interest. The New Mexico territory. He found the town's telegraph operator, a mousy man named Peterson, and using a portion of his saved wages from an army scouting job, paid to send a carefully worded message to the U.S. Marshal's office in Santa Fe. He described Orville Vance, his age, his appearance, his propensity for drink and cards. He asked if there were any outstanding warrants. It was a long shot, a hopeful cast into a dark river. As dusk fell, Amelia was untied and dragged back to the shack. She was numb, a hollowed-out shell. That night she made a decision. She had to protect herself, and the only way to do that was to sever the one thin thread of hope she had. The next afternoon, she saw Kyle across the street. Her father had gone into the saloon for a drink, leaving her tethered to the bench. It was her only chance. Catching Kyle's eye, she gave a small, almost frantic shake of her head. Then, using her good hand, she made a clear, sharp gesture. "Go away." Her face was set in a mask of desperate resolve. Her eyes, for the first time, were not pleading for rescue, but for abandonment. "Leave me be," they screamed across the dusty expanse. "You're only making it worse." Kyle saw the gesture and understood it completely. He saw the terrible, tragic logic of it. She believed her only path to survival was to accept her cage. For him, it was like watching a trapped coyote chew off its own leg, not to escape, but to appease the trap's owner. His heart, a thing he thought long hardened by the harshness of the world, ached for her. But he gave a slow, solemn nod of acknowledgement, and turning his back, walked away down the street and out of her sight. Amelia watched him go, a single hot tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. It felt like the sun had gone out. She had extinguished her only light, believing the darkness was safer. Kyle, however, was not abandoning her. He was merely changing his strategy. Her desperate gesture had not deterred him. It had galvanized him. She couldn't fight for herself. He would have to fight for her, but not in a way she could see. He went straight to the sheriff's office. Brody was at his desk, looking as weary as ever. "You again?" Brody sighed, not looking up. "I told you. I am not here to ask you to intervene in a family matter." Kyle cut in his voice, sharp with purpose. "I am here to deliver a criminal." That got Brody's attention. He looked up, his eyebrows raised. "Oh, and who might that be?" "Orville Vance." Brody scoffed. "For what?" "Being a drunk and a terrible father. There's no warrant for that." "Perhaps not," Kyle said, moving to stand directly in front of the desk. "But I have reason to believe there may be a warrant for a man matching his description out of Santa Fe, for cheating a man named Lawrence Potter in a high-stakes card game. A man who was later found dead in an alley behind the saloon." The sheriff's demeanor changed instantly. Lawrence Potter was not some nameless drifter. He was a man with powerful connected brothers in the territorial government. His death had been ruled a robbery gone wrong, but the case was cold, and the marshals had never stopped looking for the card sharp who had vanished the same night. "Where did you hear this?" Brody asked, his voice now serious. "The world is smaller than you think," Kyle replied cryptically. He didn't mention the telegraph. He let the sheriff imagine a network of native informants. "Vance fits the description. He came from that territory. He has the temperament of a desperate cheat." Brody stared at Kyle, chewing on the inside of his cheek. This changed everything. This wasn't a messy domestic squabble anymore. This was a potential murder, a wanted fugitive, and a substantial bounty. This was the kind of grey area that a man like Brody could suddenly see in stark black and white. "The telegraph line to Santa Fe is open," Kyle said, pressing his advantage. "You can send a message to Marshal Abernathy. Describe Vance. Mention Lawrence Potter. See what kind of a response you get." Sheriff Brody stood up. The weariness was gone, replaced by the keen-eyed look of a lawman on the scent. He looked out the window towards the saloon. Orville Vance was no longer just a town drunk. He was a possibility, a solution to a headache and a feather in his own cap. "I'll do that," Brody said, his voice clipped. He looked at Kyle with a newfound respect. "And if the response is what you think it will be, then he is your prisoner," Kyle said. "And the girl is no longer his." A desperate bargain had been struck, not with threats or violence, but with information. Kyle had found the key. Orville Vance's past was the lock, and the United States Marshal Service was about to turn it. Amelia had pushed him away to save herself, but Kyle was about to prove that true freedom sometimes required someone to fight for you, especially when you no longer had the strength to fight for yourself. The telegraph from Santa Fe clattered to life the next morning, confirming Kyle's suspicions with grim finality. The message from Marshal Abernathy identified Orville Vance as a wanted fugitive with a $500 bounty on his head for robbery and questioning in a man's death. For Sheriff Brody, the matter was no longer a messy domestic issue. It was a profitable manhunt. He deputized 2 men planning to surround Vance's shack at dusk for a simple arrest. Kyle, however, knew it wouldn't be that easy. He had watched Vance all morning and saw the frayed nerves of a cornered animal. The man was jumpy-armed and ready to bolt. He found the sheriff finalizing his plan and cut straight to the point. "He knows," Kyle stated, his voice low and certain. "A wolf can smell the trap. He will not go back to the shack. He will take the girl and run for the mountains." Brody, initially dismissive, had to concede the tracker had been right so far. To lose Vance now would be an embarrassment. "All right, tracker. What's your plan?" "Let him run," Kyle replied. "Let him think he's escaping. The open country is my home, not his. We take him there away from town." It was a dangerous strategy, but it was the only one that made sense. They would turn the desert itself into a cage. Kyle's prediction proved true as the sun began its descent. A paranoid Orville Vance suddenly grabbed Amelia, yanking her from her spot and tying a rope tightly around her good wrist. "We're leaving," he hissed, dragging her not to their shack but to the livery stable. He threw her onto a horse, mounted behind her, and spurred the animal into a desperate gallop, heading east. Amelia was no longer just a beggar. She was a human shield. From a distance, Sheriff Brody's posse gave chase, but Kyle was already gone. He moved on foot, a silent shadow flowing over the rocky terrain, his knowledge of the land allowing him to cut across the horse's path. The pursuit stretched for miles, leaving the town behind for a harsh landscape of canyons and arroyos. As the last light bled from the sky, Kyle was in position, perched on a rocky outcrop overlooking a narrow canyon. He waited until Vance's exhausted horse entered the passage below, then let out the sharp, piercing cry of a hawk. It was the signal. From the far end of the canyon, Sheriff Brody and his men appeared, blocking the exit. "It's over, Vance!" Brody yelled. Panicked Orville spun his horse around, only to see Kyle standing like a sentinel, blocking the path he had just come down. He was trapped. "Stay back!" Orville screamed, drawing a pistol and pressing its cold barrel to Amelia's temple. "I'll kill her! I swear to God, I'll kill her!" Amelia's world narrowed to the circle of steel against her skin. Brody's men held their fire, the situation at a deadly impasse. "Let the girl go, Orville," Kyle said, his voice calm as he began to walk forward, his hands open. "She has nothing to do with this." "She has everything to do with you," Orville shrieked, his mind unraveling. "You brought this on me." In that instant, watching Cale walk towards death for her sake, something inside Amelia broke free. A lifetime of fear and submission was burned away by a spark of pure survival. She couldn't fight him, but she could act. With a raw scream of defiance, she threw her entire body sideways. The sudden violent shift spooked the tired horse, which reared high with a terrified whinny. Orville was thrown off balance, his grip on Amelia, slipping the gun, moving away from her head for a fraction of a second. It was the only opening Cale needed. He moved with the speed of a striking cougar. He didn't go for the gun, but for the arm holding it, twisting it back. The pistol fired with a deafening roar, the bullet blasting harmlessly into the sky as Amelia was thrown from the horse, landing hard in the sand. The fight was brutally short. Cale disarmed Orville, deflected a wild punch, and neutralized him with two swift, precise blows. Orville Vance collapsed in a heap, unconscious. Silence fell upon the canyon. Sheriff Brody and his men rode up, staring in awe at the scene. Cale ignored them. He went to Amelia and cut the rope from her wrist. He knelt before her, his dark eyes searching hers. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, tears of shock and relief streaming down her face. Staring at her father's still form, she found her voice not as a victim, but as a survivor. "No," she whispered, "I am not hurt." The ride back to Redemption Gulch was a grim parade. Orville Vance, bound and defeated, was hauled to the town jail, while Sheriff Brody boasted of the capture. As townsfolk gawked, Amelia slid from Cale's horse, trembling with exhaustion and shock. But before the crowd could close in, Martha Holloway pushed through, wrapping a firm arm around her. "Come with me, child," she said, leading Amelia away from the prying eyes and into the safety of her home. For the first time in years, Amelia was shown unconditional kindness. Later that night, Cale appeared. He found her in Martha's small parlor, clean and cared for. "He will be transported to Santa Fe," Cale said, his voice calm. "You will not see him again." He placed a heavy leather pouch on the table, the $500 bounty. "This is yours." Amelia stared at the fortune. "I can't. You saved me." "I did not do it for money," he replied. "This is not a payment. It is a tool. Use it to see a doctor in Tucson. Use it to start a new life in a place where no one knows your story. It is the beginning." He then held out his hand, a single hawk's feather resting in his palm, a symbol of strength, to see the whole path, not just the stone at your feet. Your path begins now. He gave her a rare, small smile, and then was gone as silently as he had arrived. A week later, Amelia stood by the eastbound stagecoach. She was no longer the hunched, broken girl from the boardwalk. She stood straight, her future held in a small carpet bag and the pouch of coins. After a heartfelt goodbye to Martha, she climbed aboard. As the coach lurched forward, she did not look back at the town that had been her prison. Instead, she faced the horizon, clutching the hawk feather. The sun was rising, and ahead of her lay the long, open road to dawn. Amelia's story is a raw and powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It's a journey that reminds us that even in the most desolate of circumstances, when hope seems like a forgotten language, the courage of a single individual can change everything. Her father broke her body, but men like Cale and women like Martha Holloway prove that the true strength of the frontier wasn't just in taming the land, but in mending the broken lives within it. Amelia's road was just beginning a path from victim to survivor, paved with the pain of her past and the promise of a future she could finally call her own. If this story of struggle, justice, and the fight for freedom in the Old West moved you, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates tales of true grit, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel. We have many more stories from the dusty trails and forgotten corners of history to share with you. Click the bell icon so you won't miss a single one. Thank you for listening.